raising budget. Shock. 10%, 8%.
Well, you've both sketched out the bad side of history to such an extent that I would imagine somebody early into our movement, coming in a midpoint into our movement, quite easily would feel dispirited. Not only are we to fight to abolish prisons, but we are to fight to abolish the Israeli occupation. Not only are we to abolish the Israeli occupation, but we have to end US imperialism. With such an enormous task, how have you been able to sustain your commitment through your political career? Maybe Angela, if you could start, so many people that you have walked with have transformed their views, have given up, have shed a new skin maybe. How does one maintain commitment, fighting against something that in the present and near future appears to be so vast?
Well, not everyone has changed.
There are some.
Yeah, but the people I consider my community, they have persisted. And maybe some people work in different ways than before, but I think one maintains a commitment through constant inspiration by those who are fighting the struggle. I mean, what more could I say? When I visited Palestine last year, I was impressed not only by the horrendous repression, but by the joy of the children and by a commitment to continue the struggle for freedom under the most impossible circumstances. And I always say that it's never been a question of whether I would continue this work, because I don't know how not to. I really would not know how not to. Yeah.
Noam, what about you? Given that our political class is filled with lunatics, and that whatever we seem to do, 2, 3, 4 million people can march on the streets against the war in Iraq, but they're insane. They don't seem to even see us. Why do we bother, is the question I want you to play with a little bit.
Well, first of all, I don't really agree with the analysis. The war in Iraq was bad enough, but it was nothing like the war against South Vietnam. That didn't even come close. The kinds of things that John F. Kennedy was doing, they couldn't even dream of doing in Iraq. Kennedy was carrying out saturation bombing. He was driving people into concentration camps, ultimately millions. He was carrying out chemical warfare to destroy the food and crops and livestock, and there was no protest. In fact, nobody even knew about it. He tried, I did give talks about it, but there were talks in somebody's living room, or maybe in a church with 3 people or something. Nobody cared. When the Iraq War came along, it was a huge protest. It's the first imperial invasion in history where there was a massive protest before it was even officially launched. Actually, it was underway, but it wasn't known. But before it was officially launched, there was huge protest, and that very much restricted what was done. Bad enough, but could have been a lot worse. And that's an improvement, And in fact, in my view, and this is a kind of minority view, the U.S. actually won the war in Vietnam in terms of its major goals. I could discuss it if you want. But in Iraq was a flat-out defeat. The war aims were completely, none of them were met. They were finally stated toward the end when it became obvious what the scale of defeat was. And you can see right now on what's going on. Well, okay, that's a change. And in fact, that's quite general. Like, you know, it does look now as if there's a huge number of problems to face. But just go back a few years. There were all these problems, plus a lot more. I mean, a lot's been achieved over the past, say, of course, the period we're talking about, roughly the last 50 years. Plenty of problems are gone. There are new ones coming up to deal with, fine. But I think quite apart from the fact that there is, it's a line of Martin Luther King's, who pointed out that the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. And we can get it to bend. That should be enough of an answer.
Come back to that arc of history, because it seems to me a lot of people have to pull it towards justice as well. It's not bending by itself, but we'll come back to that. Let's stay a little bit with the Middle East, and maybe building on what you just said. Do you think it's the effectiveness of the Iraqi resistance, the effectiveness of at least the people on the street in the United States, that has moved the strategy in Iran towards the strangulation, the secret strangulation of that country, rather than an open bombardment?
Yes, it's partly that, but there are other things that are happening with regard to Iran that illustrate very well how the imperial system of control and domination works right where we're sitting, places like Cambridge, Mass, not Iran. So for example, I don't know how many of you know, probably not very many, and it's not your fault because it didn't get reported. But if anyone, with regard to Iran, that's regarded, that in the United States, that's, the greatest threat to world peace. If you listen to the last presidential debate, big topic, greatest threat to world peace, press and so on. Now that raises a couple of questions. Who thinks so, first of all? It turns out to be a Western obsession. Most of the world doesn't think so. The Arab world doesn't think so. They regard the United States and Israel as the greatest threat to peace. They're not the same, so it's a Western obsession. A second question that's interesting is, what exactly is the threat? Well, we actually have an authoritative answer to that. It's given by the Pentagon and U.S. intelligence. The threat is deterrence. Iran might develop means to deter the resort to force by the United States and its clients, by Israel. And that's intolerable. If you own the world, you can't accept deterrence. But the third and most interesting question is, if you believe there's a threat, what can you do about it? Well, one way is to torture the people of Iran. But another way is to bomb them. There's a simpler way. Move towards establishing a nuclear weapons-free zone in the region. Okay? That happens to be supported by essentially the entire world. It's blocked by the United States. Just again a couple of weeks ago. Didn't get reported. But, it's kind of like if you're really a fanatic, you could find it. But there was supposed to be a conference this month in Finland to carry forward the plans to move towards a nuclear weapons-free zone. Israel refused to attend. Iran in early November said it would attend. Within days, President Obama canceled the conference. So it's not going to take place. Well, that's a simple way to move towards settling whatever problem anyone thinks there is. If there was a massive protest, massive popular movement, it could have taken place. But there can't be a massive popular movement if nobody knows about it.
Correct.
And here, it's kind of amazing, but the intellectual classes in the West and the media have been almost virtually 100% obedient in silencing all of this. You want to find out about it? I'll tell you how, but it's not easy. Now that's a major achievement of domination and control. You couldn't get that kind of obedience in a totalitarian state, and it's voluntary. You know, nobody's has a gun to their head, and nobody's being coerced not to do it. It's just internalized. You know, you don't talk about things like that. If you had a good education, you know, like all of us had, you know that you don't talk about things like that. It's just part of your nature. It's kind of like knowing that they are taking away our jobs and our money and our, you know, and so on. But it's nothing you talk about.
No, but people know that Kim Kardashian went to Bahrain. She went to Bahrain to promote some kind of milkshake or something like that. People don't realize there's almost a 2-year protest movement for democracy in Bahrain, but Kim Kardashian was there, so everything is fine. Let's build a little on this, Angela, well, these are the things I know. So, I mean, just to...
If I can say a word about it.
Please.
There is some talk about Bahrain where there was an uprising that was crushed, but what's rarely understood is the issue is not Bahrain, it's Eastern Saudi Arabia. Eastern Saudi Arabia, which is right next to Bahrain, is where most of the oil is. It's mostly Shiite, and there's terror in the West over a geographical, historical fact. If you look at the concentration of hydrocarbon reserves, it's right around the northern part of the Persian Gulf. It's Eastern Saudi Arabia, southern Iraq, southwestern Iran, mostly Shiite. If there was ever a Shiite alliance, it would control a substantial part of the world's oil. Well, you can't allow an uprising in Bahrain that might go right across the causeway, in fact has gone across the causeway, where there's plenty of violent repression. That's serious. Those are major issues for West Africa.
No, that's because of the great democracy in Saudi Arabia. Let's take that question of, voluntary silencing and come a little bit, let's talk about Gaza and Israel. I mean, Angela, you in 1973 were at, what was it, the World Youth Festival with Yasser Arafat. Then you went to the West Bank, was it? Not Gaza, West Bank. A few years ago, 2 years ago, you were in the West Bank.
Yeah, that's a big leap.
Yeah, but part of it is the fact that the Palestinian cause has been there on our map for a very long time. And, we're only talking about 11 million people. There are more people in my hometown, 14 million, than the Palestinians around the world. So the question in terms of this voluntary silencing, I wonder if you could share with us, try to help us understand why the United States tails Israel or whatever their relationship is. Why does the United States take this position that we cannot humanize the Palestinian, we cannot humanize the open-air prison of Gaza, and at the same time, we have to, as they say, stand with our ally. What is this about? People often ask, I'm at a loss. Why is there this kind of so-called, I don't know what you'd call it, tail wags the dog, dog wags the tail?
It seems to me that the point that Noam was making about the voluntary silence around Iran and other places, that this has certainly applied to Israel over the last decades. I don't think most people in this country really understand what is going on in Palestine. And my experience has been that when I've spoken about the similarities, for example, between the Jim Crow era of segregation and the segregation that exists, say, the highways on which only Israeli settlers can drive in occupied Palestine. When I've spoken about this to Black audiences, many people say, well, why didn't anyone ever tell us about this? Because if we had known, we would have been drawn towards the kind of solidarity movement that actually helped to bolster the Black freedom movement in the 60s and 70s. So I'm not saying that it's only a question of a lack of information, but if the information is not there, then how do you build a solidarity movement? And then, of course, there's the issue of the Zionist lobby that literally forces people into silence. As I mentioned, I just came back from the World Social Forum Free Palestine. And as I understand it, originally the funding for that conference was supposed to be $4 million. But it was reduced to $200,000. So that vast numbers of people who had planned to attend and who were promised plane tickets, especially from Palestine, were not able to attend. And this is in Brazil, right? This is the way this is working in Brazil, which I mean, it was interesting. I spoke in a small town in Brazil last week, or whatever it was, at a conference that took place on Black Consciousness Day in Cruz das Almas, which is in Bahia near Salvador. And when I mentioned Israeli apartheid, people, that was the most enthusiastic response. And so I said, this is really interesting. You know, here at this university, it was a very young university, 5 years old, a university based on affirmative action. It's what they call the first Black university in Brazil, because 80% of the students there are Black. And they were most excited about what is going on, about Palestine solidarity and speaking out against Israel.
Yeah, maybe Noam, you can help us, and then we're going to move on. Help us with that. How is it that a part of the world where 11 million people, roughly, have been dislocated from their lands, how has that become such a touchstone that in various locations, there is this organic sense of solidarity? Help us understand that. On the one side, I agree it's a lack of information about the specificity, but this has become a touchstone. What is that about?
Are you asking why there's solidarity or why the U.S. is an outlier on this?
Maybe both.
The solidarity, because this is probably the longest military occupation, at least in modern history. And it's pretty brutal. I was just in Gaza a couple of weeks ago, in fact, and it's not pleasant. I mean, it's a harsh, brutal occupation. Everything that Israel is doing, it's doing because we allow it to. The United States, if the United States does not allow it, the United States, Israel goes exactly as far as the U.S. allows, not an inch farther, for perfectly obvious reasons. Right now, for example, as front pages are talking about settlement programs in what's called the E1 corridor. Israel's been, that's a very important, all the settlements are totally illegal. Everyone, even the government, the leading legal authorities in Israel agree with this. Of course it's illegal. It's in violation of the Geneva Convention. It's in violation of explicit Security Council orders on It's as illegal as you can get. But they want to extend the settlement in a way which will complete the bisection of the West Bank. These programs were developed primarily under Clinton, incidentally. The settlement of the Mala Dumim, the settlement to the east. Every American president, up until Obama, has prevented them from settling the E1 corridor. Every single one. They've been wanting to settle it for 25 years. Every time they try, the American president says, sorry, you can't do that. And when the U.S. lays its foot down, those are orders. That's the way the world works. Obama is the first one to have failed to do it.
Thank God we have a Democrat in the White House.
Well, but why has he failed it? Well, we're not pressing him to. We're not, and when you, let's get back to your question, why keep going on? The difference between now and a couple of years ago here is enormous. I mean, up until a few years ago, I've been giving talks and writing about this for 50 years. Up until a few years ago, I literally had to have police protection, even at my own university, just to give a talk. And now it's the biggest issue on campus. You have huge audiences, engaged. You can't get a hostile question. Well, that's a big change, literally a big change. And it can make a difference. If you remember back to the reasons why the U.S. is kind of off the spectrum on this, I think they're interesting. I think they're pretty complex, not all that complex. One simple question is, how much, just ask yourselves, how much do the Palestinians contribute to U.S. power, and how much does Israel contribute to U.S. power? Okay, it's infinite. If you don't contribute to U.S. power, you just don't have any rights by the most elementary principles of statecraft. In fact, the Palestinians have a negative rights. Not only do they have no wealth, no power, no support among the wealthy, like the oil dictators, Saddam and so on, but they have a negative effect because they stir up just what you saw in Brazil, and even more so in the Arab world, on what's, kind of the racist phrase, Arab Street. We don't talk about the British street, we talk about the Arab street. There's people there. On the Arab street, this is a big issue, and that can threaten the dictatorships that the U.S. supports. So they have negative rights. On the other hand, Israel is a rich, powerful country. It's got a very advanced military system, tightly linked to the United States, very tightly linked to the U.S., like the drones that are part of, that are Obama's global assassination campaign. But the technology was pioneered in Israel. If you read WikiLeaks exposures, one of them listed places in the world that are of extreme strategic significance to the United States. One of them was an industrial complex right outside of Haifa, the Rafael Industrial Complex, advanced military technology. And the relations are so close that the corporation has actually moved its management offices to the United States so they get closer to funding. So there's close links in military industry and intelligence, in just high-tech investment, like big corporations like Intel invest there and so on. And there's strategic significance, which we could go into. But there are also other factors which shouldn't be overlooked. There are cultural factors, which I think are pretty significant. It's not a big secret that the United States has, throughout its history, it's been off the spectrum in religious extremism. More than half, about 60% of Republicans think the world was created a couple thousand years ago. You can't find countries, I don't think there's any country in the world that's anything like this. And this extends across the board. But furthermore, Christian Zionism, which is an elite phenomenon too. Goes back way before Jewish Zionism. Goes back to Britain in the 19th century. Lord Balfour, Balfour Declaration fame, was a Christian Zionist. Woodrow Wilson read the Bible every day. The Bible says that God said that the Jews have to go back to Palestine. Okay? You had high officials in the Roosevelt administration who were saying that if the Jews go back to Palestine, it'll be the greatest event in world history. On top of that, there's a huge evangelical population, enormous. They have a further story, if you know this, about how this, I won't go into it, but it requires that the Jews go back to Palestine. There's a huge war, everyone gets killed, and the saved souls rise to heaven. That's tens of millions of people in the United States, enormous. They're big supporters of, they're very strongly anti-Semitic, because all the Jews are going to go to hell too. But we want to go back to Palestine. And there's another factor, which is never barely discussed, but I think is quite important. You take a look at the countries that are strongly supportive of Israel. The strongest ones are the United States, Canada, and Australia. What do these countries have in common? They're settler colonial societies. It's not the British and Indian. You don't just rule the society, you exterminate the natives. And that must be a good thing, because we did it, so how could it not be a good thing? Well, okay, it's kind of the kind of thing they're doing. So there's a natural, instinctive support for it. And you can see it in the literature, bits and pieces here and there. Like,
even they actually didn't vote with the U.S. at the recent recent UN vote.
who didn't vote with them?
Canada.
Yes,
Canada
they did.
I mean, Australia did.
Australia abstained because of a big conflict inside the Labour Party. The Gillard, the Prime Minister, wanted to vote, and there was an uproar in the Labour Party, and they kind of got her to abstain. But they've been voting with the U.S. for some time. Yeah,
So who
but-
was it? It was Canada and the Czech Republic.
Palau,
And
and all the U.S. former
the
protectorates.
former protectorate.
the ones
I
that
mean,
are under-
they're real countries. But
the core issues, which I didn't even mention, go into our strategic issues. And that goes back to 1967. The U.S. relation with Israel, its current one, was established in 67. But before that, there wasn't anything like this hysteria about Israel. What happened in 1967 is that Israel performed a great service to the United States. It smashed secular Arab nationalism and supported extreme Islamic fundamentalism. Exactly what happened. Saudi Arabia is the center of extremist Islamic fundamentalism. It's the main ally of the United States and Britain before it. That's where most of the oil is. They're being threatened by secular nationalism based in massive Egypt. Israel solved that problem. That's when everything changed radically. It's been going on.
See, I think it would be really important to bring some of these issues into the prison abolitionist movement. The prison abolitionist movement. And I know many of you who are here this evening are supporting organizations like Critical Resistance who are calling for the abolition of prisons. So what happens if we broaden that frame and we think about Israel not only in relation to the many prisons in which it holds Palestinian political prisoners, but also in the use of the carceral technology throughout the society. And this is the point that I was trying to allude to when I said that if we are prison abolitionists, we should also be opposed to open-air prisons. And any visit to the West Bank would persuade one that one is inside a prison, especially near the wall or a checkpoint. And so what happens if we reimagine the prison abolitionist movement that in this country has largely focused on a US-based prison industrial complex? What would happen if we created a much broader frame? I suppose the problem I'm trying to talk about is the fact that almost inevitably the question of Israel and Palestine tends to be isolated from most other radical and progressive issues. As a matter of fact, there are many people who you might consider really radical, except on the question of Israel, right? So how do we address that? And especially people who are involved in the abolitionist movement. How do we help to address that isolation and integrate these issues into our movements? I think that one of the reasons why the U.S. is able to support Israel with absolute impunity is because there are very few movements that will make themselves visibly seen and heard in solidarity with Palestine. So what can we do about that? How do we create the movements?
There are harder cases than that.
I mean, we could spend hours on the question of creating movements because, that's another problem is that we always say we should make mass movements and then people dedicate their lives trying to build it and we wait for the breakthroughs. I mean, building a movement is burrowing like a mole, waiting for the breakthrough. And it's coming. Yes.
This is amazing.
No, but that's not even from me, that's from Marx. When he says well borrowed old mole. We're going to get a question from the Boston Area Youth Organizing Project. But where are they? I hope they're not going to start their question, although it will be like the Occupy General Assembly. I think we're going to pivot a little to basic questions of human decency. So as soon as they get, which is actually a very difficult thing for people to wrap their heads around, the question of human decency, how that we can live, in a carceral state and yet believe that we live in the American dream. Somehow we've lost the plot of human decency. So,
let's jump to the Beantown question. We're going to jump to the Beantown question real quick. Oh, sorry. Hello, my fault. My name is Carlos Rios. I'm a part of Boston Area Youth Organization Project. And my question is, how do you see...
Well, wait a minute, where are you first? Can you wave? Hello. Okay. You can walk and talk.
So my question is, how do you see schools resembling prisons, and how do we transform them?
Resembling prisons, and how do you transform them? So Angela, why don't you tell us, how do you see schools resembling prisons and how do you transform them?
Well, all over this country, in poor communities, especially communities of color, over the last 2 decades, schools have come increasingly to resemble prisons with a focus that is often much more on discipline than on learning. In a sense, you can say that the schools that so many of our young people attend are finishing schools, directing people to the juvenile facilities, and then the trajectory is school, juvenile facility, adult prison. And when we talk about abolishing prisons, we can't see that task as being in isolation from all of the other related institutions. If we want to abolish prisons, then we're, in a sense, we're going to have to abolish schools in the way they currently reproduce the prison and its disciplinary technologies. And as many of us have said for such a long time, if schools were really doing their job, that is to say, teaching young people how to imagine the future, and teaching kids how to appreciate learning, and not just for what it can bring them in the future, not just as a commodity, not just for the money that they will be able to make when they get the degree, but rather for the way in which it, you know, my mother used to always say, education broadens your horizon. I mean, she said that to me over and over and over again. And later I really understood what she meant, because I was no longer just satisfied with living in Birmingham, Alabama, and I went on and did a lot of things. But the point is, went a lot of places. But the point is, for kids who do not have the ability to imagine themselves as adults, and who often think that they will die before their 21st birthday. The schools are actually encouraging this. They are producing this, I wouldn't exactly call it nihilism, but I would call it this sense, this collective depression. And if we're going to abolish prisons, we definitely have to radically transform our schools.
Professor Chomsky, you talked about busing, but you almost made it out to be like a project engendered to tear people away from each other. You know, when you mentioned the busing crisis in Boston, can you elaborate a little more, not only on the busing issue, but on the structure of late 20th century, early 21st century schooling and what's happening to it?
The busing was done out of goodwill by nice, decent, liberal people who were for whom class-based attitudes were so profound that I don't think they could see what they were doing. So take Boston, right here. It's typical. Works just the way I said. The busing system was organized by one of the main liberal judges, you know, Harvard trustee, okay, nice guy. But it was designed so that it simply brought together poor communities in urban Boston. So yes, black kids went from Roxbury to South Boston and the other way around, but they didn't go to the affluent suburbs. And in the affluent suburbs, they didn't go into the inner city. And if they tried to do that, there would have been such a, you know, political howl. They couldn't even start it. The end result was to antagonize the people who were involved in the busing. First of all, because they didn't want them to be in our communities, and also because they could see that the rich guys in the suburbs are free from this. You couldn't have made a worse proposal. And that happened all over the country. There's a lot of studies of this. Through the 70s, the busing programs, which were well-intentioned in a sense, were one of the main factors in driving the white working class far to the right, to the point that they're now a Republican base. Democrats don't even try. As far as the schools are concerned, I think it's somewhat more nuanced. I think schools can be oppressive, and they can undermine independence and creativity, or they can be liberating. And sometimes it's both. I think if you think through your own experiences, most of you, you'll have had a school experience which are of both types. There are teachers who really work hard to inspire independent thought, creativity, searching for things, and so on. There are others who force you into a mold. Now, they are controlled by a supervisory system. Teachers want to have limited independence, no matter how dedicated they are. For one thing, there's enormous disparities in school funding. So in the United States, the schools are funded mainly by property taxes. Well, the wealth is so segregated that if you're in the affluent suburbs, you get well-funded schools. If you're in the inner city, you get defunded schools. And the best teacher in the world isn't going to be able to do much if kids come to school, not having eaten breakfast and their father's in jail, and they don't, so on and so forth. It already starts in a way which the best teacher in the world can do very little. But also, there are programs. This is another part of the backlash since the 70s to institute a kind of a disciplinary controlling system in the schools. So, the last decade, it's been called, No Child Left Behind, Race to the Top, whatever name it's given, it's teach to test. Those of you who are teachers have been through this knows how that works. Teach to test is a way of guaranteeing not only that nobody learns anything, but they have no interest in being in school. I mean, every one of you, this is something we all know from our own experiences. Just looking around, I suspect most of you have gone to pretty good schools. Anyone who's made it to a good school has an experience in which you had to take an exam in something you didn't care at all about, and you didn't care what happened, but we're obedient types. That's how we got to good schools. So we studied for the exam. You did well. A week later, you forgot what the subject was. That's the way it works. Teaching, and it also dulls creativity and interest. There's the kind of thing that Angela was talking about, but it's even true, say, in the sciences. Actually, there's interesting work on this. There's a lot of criticism from leading scientific organizations like American Association for the Advancement of Science about how science teaching has been redesigned so as to impose memorization of things that people don't understand and to undermine the search for discovery. So you memorize the periodic table or the enzymes that do something, and you know what it's about, you don't care, and you don't understand the point of doing it. There are other programs, and this goes all the way from kindergarten to graduate school, which are quite the opposite. So, for example, one of the programs that was recently discussed in the main science journal was a kindergarten program where the children were given a dish, and the dish had items in it, pebbles, shells, seeds, a bunch of other things. And they had a task, figure out which ones are the seeds. First thing they did is had what they called a scientific conference. The kids sat around and tried to figure out ways in which you could determine what the seeds are. And they had some suggestions, they tried them, had other ones. The teacher's kind of guiding it, but letting the kids explore. Finally, they figured out which ones the seeds were, did experiments and showed it. At that point, each child was given a microscope, a magnifying glass, and the teacher broke the seeds open, and they looked inside to see what made it grow. That's exciting. That's the way you learn why it's interesting to understand something about the world.
Let me ask you something, Noam, in relation to your critique of busing. How would you have proposed desegregating the schools?
With the affluent suburbs.
With the affluent suburbs.
That was a good idea. It was just implemented in a way which made it as bad as possible.
So you're saying that...
Like bring the kids from South Boston out to Lexington.
Oftentimes we don't realize the extent to which we reproduce the work of this retributive justice system in our relations with one another. So there's that level. Then, of course, there are very interesting experiments that are happening in schools, for example, around transformative justice, restorative justice. How do you teach children how to resolve their conflicts by talking to one another, rather than fighting? My sister works with an organization which is called Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth, and they discovered that, wow, I guess Oakland must be in the house. And they've had the experience, particularly when they're dealing with elementary schools, that the children very quickly get it. They get it so quickly that she was telling a story about this one kid who was brought back to the school because he got into a fight somewhere in the community. And the kid says, "We can't fight in our school, and we can't even fight in our community." But it's interesting to hear how the children learn how to talk to one another and how to resolve their differences in circles, bringing other people into the conversation rather than assuming that the only way you can resolve it is through violence. And I think that we have to build on, all of the important work that's been done by, truth and reconciliation processes, and to reflect on the way in which we perpetuate those impulses in our relations to one another.
The last question is from the Roxbury Environmental Empowerment Project.
You'll have to come all the way down to the stage. Hi! Ask it really loud.
I need a microphone.
I have it up here, so you have to talk really loud.
Hi guys! So my name is Stacia, and I'm a youth organizer at the Roxbury Environmental Empowerment Project. And my question is, what questions do you have for the young people today? We are leaders in our community now, and we will continue to do so. What advice do you have for getting adult allies engaged with our struggles?
Now you want to start? What advice do you have? How do we get the adults involved with the youth leaders?
take a look at what young people have done over the years. Actually, if you look around and you think about the movements that have been formed, became significant, to a very substantial extent, they had a youth initiative and was carrying it forward from the very beginning. So take, say, the Civil Rights Movement. I mean, it has a long history, it goes back centuries, but in the modern period, it took off in 1960 when a couple of students, 4 black students in a black university, went to a lunch counter and sat and wanted to be served. And of course, arrested and brutalized and so on. Could have ended there. But instead, some more students came the next day. Pretty soon, you had the SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, student group forum. They were at the cutting edge of the Civil Rights Movement. You got freedom riders, people coming down from the north, students mostly. There was a scattering of older people and activists, but most of the initiative was from the youth. And it got ended up being a mass movement. Well, you know, that just case after case like that. So I think the advice is do the things that you're able to do. And there's plenty of them. I mean, was this an environmental group? I mean, you know, you're facing the worst problem that the human species has faced in its history. I mean, literally. We are now marching towards a precipice, and we're going to fall off it, and it would be basically destruction of the species. It's never happened in human history before. And we're marching right towards it, eyes open. You take a look at the presidential candidates, the presidential debates, both the Republican Party program didn't even have anything, didn't say anything about global warming. The Democratic Party program had a couple of vapid phrases. Both presidential candidates were euphoric about the fact that we can move towards 100 years of energy independence by using more fossil fuels. You know, you read the main elite intellectual newspapers, New York Times, big story on the melting of the Arctic ice. The first half of the story says the worst ever, you know, all kinds of catastrophes are going to come and so on. Second half of the story says fantastic opportunity, opens up the region for more mining, for more extraction of fossil fuels and so on. So let's escalate the catastrophe. This is happening all over the world. In fact, about the only organized groups that are really trying to stop it are indigenous groups. You look around the world, and everywhere with substantial indigenous populations, they're in the lead. And the countries where they're a majority or a big plurality actually have gone so far as to institute constitutional rights for nature and insistence on Ecuador, for example. This program to try to get funded by the rich countries to keep the oil in the ground instead of lifting it and growing that way. Well, you know, unless we can get the sensibility of First Nations or indigenous people, whatever they call themselves, different ways. Once we can gain that kind of sensibility, we're heading to disaster. And for young people, you're the ones who are going to pay the price. You know, you're going to see a world in which global temperature's going over the fabled 2 degrees centigrade, which is supposed to be a tipping point. We're getting very close to it. It might go over it pretty soon. That's going to be the world in which you and your children are going to live in. So you better do something about it fast. And there's ways to do it, and I think you know what they are.
Well, I totally agree with Noam that historically young people have always been the ones to give leadership to revolutionary, creative, imaginative struggles. And it seems to me that the adults Well, I don't know whether I would use the term adult, because I think a lot of young people are pretty adult. But the older people who are most effective are the ones who understand the importance of an egalitarian, intergenerational movement. One in which the youth aren't marginalized as the youth. You know what I'm talking about. It's always the youth. Rather seen as the spark without which movements cannot occur. And so, no, I guess I can say we are counting on you. We are counting on you to lead us toward these radical futures about which we have been speaking this evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Thank you for being such wise people to share with us.